All right. So today we're gonna continue with the endings of the Gospel of Mark. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, and so we're gonna move quickly. I would recommend today, especially, that you have your Bibles open to Mark chapter 16, verses 8 through 9, because I'm gonna make references to the verses, and it's best if you can just see them because I didn't put them up on the slides. So we are going to just quick review. We are at the last piece of external evidence. Last week we covered external evidence with the manuscripts, and we looked at the number of manuscripts that have the longer ending and the various endings, I should say. And then we looked at the earliest manuscripts, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And then we looked at the versional witnesses briefly. And then we got to the patristic evidences, which is where we left off. And so we started with Justin Martyr, not because he weighs in on the argument, but because he alludes to Mark chapter 16, the long ending of Mark 16. He alludes to it. He doesn't quote directly from it. He doesn't even use the same order of references. They're rearranged, but he's talking about things that you would only get from the longer ending of Mark because it's unique to the longer ending of Mark. And so we can say because of this, we know that the longer ending is very early because Justin Martyr is alluding to it. The first actual talk about it we get is from Irenaeus, who's just a few years later and even contemporary with Justin Martyr. And he says directly that his most accurate manuscripts have this longer portion. And he also affirms that the majority of his manuscripts have this longer portion. And you can't read Irenaeus's quote in any way, but Irenaeus thinks that this is scripture. So we know this is earlier than our earliest manuscripts, this reference. And then we had Tatian. We talked about him. Tatian wrote the Diatessaron. The Diatessaron, for those of you who don't remember, is a harmony of the Gospels, where they take all four Gospels and they merge them together into one cohesive story. Tatian later, he is deemed a heretic because his views develop and he has some theology that gets him in trouble and he becomes a heretic. But he wrote the Diatessaron earlier in his Christian walk, in which his views were more orthodox. He was a disciple of Justin Martyr. But Tatian, when he does his harmony of the Gospels in the Diatessaron, he includes the longer ending. And then we have Eusebius, and this is where we left off last week. Eusebius, this is really interesting. So Eusebius, you see you got the red X up there. That's because Eusebius actually is going to talk about the longer ending and the shorter ending, or the abrupt ending, I should say, the longer ending and the abrupt ending. And he's going to refer to these. You know what? I also believe Eusebius, if I remember correctly, I'm going to say it. Someone can fact check me, but I'm nearly certain Eusebius is our first mention of the Friar as well. We had the quotes, or we had the reference to the Friar from Eusebius long before we ever found a manuscript that contained it. So we knew of the Friar because of Eusebius, but we didn't have any manuscripts until very recently. So I found that interesting. So he's actually recording quite a few of the variants. Now, what he's doing here is, as you read his work, he is responding to a question that seems to show up frequently in the 3rd and 4th century, which is a discrepancy between the timing of the resurrection between Mark and Matthew, where Mark has, it's seemingly, in their view, I don't see this. Like when I read it, I'm not seeing this discrepancy, but it comes up. You're going to see it. It comes up frequently during the 3rd and 4th century, that there's an understanding that Jesus is either rising very late on the Sabbath or very early on the first day. That seems to be the controversy. And Eusebius is responding to this controversy on how this should be handled. And as he goes through this, he says, essentially, he breaks it down and he says, our best manuscripts and our earliest manuscripts do not contain this longer ending. So one way to resolve this controversy is to say it's not canon. So we just don't use the longer ending, controversy resolved, just follow what Matthew says. But then he makes a second part to that. He says, but there are many who do hold to this longer ending as canon. And then he goes on to explain how you can reconcile the two passages. So in Eusebius's view, some would say Eusebius is being hypothetical, but I don't think you can read it fully and suggest that he's actually saying hypothetically you could say that it's not canon. I think it is his view. He's pretty clear that what he considers his oldest and best and majority manuscripts do not contain the longer ending. And so he does not hold it as canon, but he acknowledges that some people do. So that's interesting. So I would say Eusebius is our first real witness to say it's not canon. Then we have Jerome. Jerome is doing the exact same thing as Eusebius. He's answering the exact same objection. In fact, he's answering it so closely that some people say he's just repeating Eusebius. He's not actually coming up with his own thoughts. He's repeating Eusebius. But he does add some extra details in his response that Eusebius doesn't. When he speaks of the earliest and best manuscripts that he has, and the majority as well, let me actually double check. Yes, okay, so all three, earlier, best, and majority. Earlier, best, and majority, Jerome says they do not contain the long ending of Mark. And he answers it the same way. He says, the answer to this, you could just remove the longer ending as canon, problem solved, follow Matthew. But if not, if you hold to the longer canon, here's how you can reconcile the two passages. Okay, interesting. Well, the one thing that he does that is different, I shouldn't say one thing, but one thing that is actually different is Eusebius refers to the Greek manuscripts specifically. So he says our earliest Greek manuscripts, where Eusebius is more general, just our earliest manuscripts. And likely he could be referring to Latin there. But then this is where it gets complicated. Because Jerome says all of this, and to me, I read that, and I'm like, oh, it's settled. In Jerome's mind, it's not canon. He's answering the exact same way Eusebius is answering. But then he writes the Latin Vulgate. And what does he do with the Latin Vulgate? He inserts the longer ending. And then I was like, okay, maybe he puts a critical note. Maybe he has a critical note where he says this isn't, nope, no critical note. He writes it in without any mention that there are manuscripts that don't have it. And so what do I do with Jerome? I don't know. I give him an X and a check, because on one hand he says, hey, our earliest, our best, the majority doesn't contain it, but then he writes the Latin Vulgate and he puts it in without a critical note. So as far as I can tell, if I was going to be a strong advocate and not try to handle this with a balanced hand, I would say he changed his mind and he wrote it in the Latin Vulgate and he changed his mind. That would be, I think that's possible evidence that he either changed his mind or he just included it because he didn't want to exclude it. Some suggest he included it because out of fear that other people might be upset that he didn't include it because it was so well widely received at this point. I don't think that's the case. I don't see good evidence for that. The evidence we have is he included it, and he included it without a critical note. I think that's powerful evidence in and of itself. Okay? And then we have Victor of Antioch. Now, normally I wouldn't even bother going this far after Jerome. Once I start going into the 5th and 6th century, it's going to be, I said this earlier, it becomes very clear that everyone has it at that point. So Victor of Antioch, he's interesting because he's answering the same question as Jerome did, as Eusebius did. He's talking about this discrepancy in the rise of Christ. And what's fascinating about this is he changes it. He says his earliest and his best manuscripts and his majority have it. So his is flipped. So he thinks the longer ending is in his best, his earliest, and his majority. I found that to be interesting. Okay, so here we have kind of this, kind of a split. I would say the weight of the evidence for the longer ending is with the fathers. The fathers would say, would affirm it. I should say the patristic era affirms it. So that's interesting. And then we have Origen of Antioch. Origen of Antioch Now, this one is an interesting one because he is in a dispute with Celsus. This is our only silent witness that I really care to talk about, because he's the only one that, as you're reading his argument against Celsus, all right, he's dealing with a heretic and he's building an argument against Celsus's arguments, and he's working through Mark to build his argument. And as you're following his argument, he just keeps going, and he's working through Mark. And then we get to where the longer ending would be, which seemingly, if he was aware of it, it would be there. And like he would use this longer ending. It would help him build his next point if he had it. So it sets the expectation that if he had it, he would have used it. It's not cut and dry. All right. I don't want to make this bigger than it is, but I think there's good reason to think that if he had the longer ending, he would have used it. So I'll leave that for what it is. I'm not going to come down hard one way or the other. Dealing with silent witnesses is harder, especially when you're talking about the ending of Mark, because it is the ending of the gospel. It was so much easier when I was working through the woman caught in adultery because it's in the middle of the gospel. So if you skipped it, it was obvious. But if you didn't use the ending, is it because you just didn't use the ending? You got to as far as you wanted to get, and you didn't need to go any further, or because you didn't have the ending? It's a little bit more gray. So I'm going to be Origen. Okay, you already talked about spelling mistakes before. This is a spelling mistake. Origen spelt wrong. It's supposed to be E-N, not I-N, but because our English word origin is spelt that way, I write it wrong all the time. And also autocorrect sometimes grabs me too. Anyway, I had a spelling mistake last week that my wife told me about just before we started class today, so I didn't have time to fix that one. All right. So that's our patristic evidence. So as a way of summary, our earliest and best copies of the Greek copies support the longer ending. Our later majority copies support the longer ending. Our early versional witnesses support the abrupt ending. The later versional witnesses support the long ending. And I would say the majority of patristic era evidence supports the longer ending as well. And so from there, when we start talking about this, I think it's normally I don't talk about internal evidence. Internal evidence is where we start to dig into the story itself, the account itself, from the author's perspective. Okay, how would the author write? We're going to start getting into his vocabulary and style. And I will say probably 95% of the time when I start doing text critical work and I'm reading people and they get into internal evidence, it is hotly debated. It is very subjective on how they're interpreting what an author should or shouldn't have done with regard to how to handle this textual variant. So I often ignore, and I ignored it largely on the women caught in adultery because I didn't find it helpful. I found the arguments very subjective. It's two scholars saying the exact opposite things about the same situation, and I don't put a lot of weight in internal evidence. The internal evidence for Mark is quite different, and we are going to work through the internal evidence because you'll see that there's good arguments and bad arguments. We're going to go through both. And I'm going to work through these arguments. And again, I'm working through them kind of how they were presented to me as I was doing my study. So as I'm working through them, you'll see that sometimes I'm siding with the longer ending because that's what the evidence is pointing to. And sometimes I'm siding with the abrupt ending because that's what the evidence is pointing to. So you're just going to need to be weighing the evidence in your own mind, weighing the pros and cons to these two endings as we work through this. For scholars, generally speaking, what we talk about, primary evidence is our Greek manuscripts. That's our primary. Secondary evidence is our versional witnesses and patristic citations. And then tertiary evidence is going to be internal evidence. So this is the lowest weight you'll give it is on this one, but I still think its weight is quite powerful. And so, again, at the end of this, I will give you my position, where I land. Also, what we're looking for here by looking at internal evidence, we're trying to decipher, did Mark write this? Is Mark the author of this? So if you remember the profile pics I had up here before, Wasserman, Head, and Wallace, they would say Mark didn't write it. And then you have Snap, Lunn, and Robinson. They would say Mark did write it. And there'll be two different views too. Lunn and Snap don't agree on how this came to be, okay? Even though they both think Mark wrote the longer ending, they disagree about how it came to be. So I'm kind of setting up some of the arguments for you here. Snap believes that the longer ending is authored by Mark, but was written later by Mark in a separate work, okay? And that his colleagues later, because Mark either he ended the Gospel of Mark early, abruptly, and unintentionally due to an emergency. This is Snap's theory, and his colleagues later saw this other work, said it fits with the narrative, and inserted the longer ending. So it's still Markan, it's still canon. It's just, you'll see that this is responding to internal evidence. Okay, I'm just setting it up for you now. Lunn, on the other hand, he thinks it's cohesive. It just drives from verse 8 to verse 9, and there's no reason to think that there's any separate work, and keeps going. You're going to see, I'm just kind of setting you up for that. You're going to see Lunn's argument is very weak, and why Snap makes the theory he makes as we start working through this longer ending. And I want you to think of internal evidence like this, okay, before we get started. Internal evidence is a bunch of small little pieces, okay, that by themselves don't mean a whole lot. But when you start putting them together, they start to build a case, okay? I'll give you an example, because this just happened to Sheila and I Friday, I think it was. We had a letter come in the mail for Abby. It was addressed to Abby. Clearly child's handwriting. No return address on it, so I didn't know where it was coming from. Just Abby on the front, children's handwriting. I opened it up. I read the inside. It's a card on the front that's a picture of a pharmacy, like an artistic pharmacy. Okay, weird. Then I open it up and it says, Abby, please come to my party. And that's all it says. Doesn't say who the my is. I have no idea who wrote this. So my first thought was it was Lily. I was like, maybe it's Lily. But I start racking my brain. Maybe it's Fern. Maybe it's, I'm thinking of all the little girls at church who might write Abby a letter to come to a party. It doesn't even say it's a birthday party, so I'm not sure. So I'm racking my brain. Is this a birthday party? You know, whose birthdays are coming up? I show it to Sheila. And she's also wondering, who is this from? And we're talking about it. We're trying to figure it out. And she's like, well, maybe it's Juniper, Abby's cousin. And I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't thought about that. She has a birthday coming up as well. And I was like, and we're just entirely unsure who sent this. But our first clue was we also had another letter come in that was from my sister thanking us for going to her wedding reception. And we're like, okay, well, these two pieces of mail came at the same time. Juniper is her daughter. Maybe it is Juniper. And then we're investigating. Now we're looking really close at the envelope. And we notice that there's a rubber stamp that's dog bite awareness on both of these cards. I'm like, that's interesting. We notice that the stamps in the corners are both American flags. Not identical, but they're both American flags. That's interesting. We also noticed that both of these came from the same post office in Boston. That's interesting. Then I said, look, the cards themselves and the envelopes are the exact same size. And then I was like, is there anything on the front that would indicate that this was hand-picked like we do when we go to the store? And there were nothing. They were both abstract art. I was like, okay, this was probably a gift card set, and they both came from the set. And so they're all the same size cards, and they're all the same size envelopes. Then so we're working through all of this, and then we noticed there's a date on them as well. That was from the post office, and it was the same date, so we knew they were sent at the same time. all of this, little pieces of evidence. One piece or another by itself doesn't raise a whole lot. But by the time we were done, we're like, it has to be Juniper. These cards came from the same house. And we know one of them is my sister. The other one has to be her daughter. And so that's what we're looking at. We have Mark chapters 1 through 16, verse 8, we know is Mark. No one's arguing. The question is 9 through 20 also Mark? And so we're going to look at a lot of little pieces of evidence as we work through this, and we're going to try to build the case, whether Mark wrote it or he didn't write it, looking at style, looking at little pieces of evidence. So the first piece of evidence I often see brought up is vocabulary. There's a lot of unique vocabulary in the long ending of Mark. All right, so some of this vocabulary is the word disbelieve is only used on the long ending. Harm, confirmed, 11, accompany, after these things, go, worked with, deadly, those who had been with him as a phrase to refer to the disciples. That's unique to the long ending. And snakes is unique to the long ending. Now, what happens here? These are unique words. And there's more unique words than these ones. I didn't list them all because I'm kind of going to eliminate this whole list. Because what can happen with vocabulary is you're just looking at unique words in this section. And you can put way too much weight on this. Again, we're looking at little pieces of evidence, but I'm not even sure that this is good evidence. That Mark, again, this is raised to demonstrate that Mark didn't write it because there's unique vocabulary than the rest of Mark. Here's the problem. You have to set the expectation that Mark would have used these words in the rest of his gospel if he knew about them. But let's look at the word snakes, for example. Where are snakes? Down here, snakes. All right, snakes. In all of the Gospels, Matthew is the only one who references snakes other than Mark here. And he does it metaphorically to refer to the scribes and Pharisees. Mark has no reason up to this point to mention snakes. So there's no real expectation for me to say that Mark should be using the word snakes in his gospel. How about 11? Well, prior to like 7 verses ago, I'm being inflammatory here. There were 12 disciples. There's no reason to refer to the 11 until after Judas dies. So, and then what are we supposed to just suggest? Part of raising the whole point of vocabulary is to suggest that this isn't in Mark's vocabulary. He doesn't write this way. Are we to suggest he knows the number 12, but not the number 11? So as you can see that these raising this vocabulary this way in unique ways just doesn't work. And Snap does a really good job too at responding to this, because Snap says, if you take Mark chapter 15, verse 40, and all the way to Mark 16, verse 4, we have more unique words there than we do in the long ending. But no one's questioning whether or not that is authored by Mark. It would seem silly to, and it does, it's a little silly to just pull out vocabulary arbitrarily and start suggesting that, well, in this section it's unique, therefore it may not be written by him. You can do that. You start doing that through all the Gospels, and you're going to start ripping out whole chunks of the Gospels because there's unique vocabulary. So vocabulary, to me, the only time that I think this works well is when we're talking about writings that are centuries apart and we're trying to determine if it's a forgery, okay? When they use vocabulary that didn't exist earlier. So it's later vocabulary, a later word that was developed being, like, for example, we do this with the Book of Mormon, that there are words in the Book of Mormon that couldn't have existed in the time period in which the Book of Mormon claims to have be written. They refer to horses in America, and horses didn't exist yet. They were brought over. And so things of that nature were like, that can't be the right time frame because it's referring to the wrong vocabulary. It'd be like, imagine reading a first century work and someone mentions television. You're like, no, wait a minute. That didn't exist. right? So that sort of thing. So I think vocabulary works really well when you're talking about words that didn't exist or senses that didn't exist from particular words because of language change. When you're talking about works that are contemporary, I think this is a lot harder to work with. And so generally speaking, the vocabulary lists against the long ending of Mark, I don't find them be helpful. I think this is weak argumentation and not inconclusive. I just don't think it's good. I think I would not reject the long ending of Mark based on vocabulary. So we're going to do something that's a lot more technical. And so for the rest of the class, we're going to be more technical. We're going to be talking about Greek a lot more. And so you're going to learn some things about Greek. And you're going to need to in order to understand how these arguments work. But now we're going to get into his style, not his vocabulary, but the way he writes. Okay, and this kind of works like at my job where I write code, and the code is a language. Okay, and it's all numbers. It's just straight numbers, numerical numbers. And I write in code, and my colleagues, they write in code. And we can write the exact same program, and we'll write it differently. In fact, I could open up a program and identify who wrote it based on how it was written. I'd be like, oh, I know who wrote this because he does it this way. It's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of style. A particular style demonstrates to me which colleague wrote it. Another thing that I'll find interesting is sometimes I'll open a program and I'll work through and I'll be like, yep, this is so-and-so who wrote this one, but he doesn't write that way. Someone has inserted code into his program that's not his. Whether it's another programmer or someone inadvertently did it, but I can identify it because it's not his style. And they can do the same with me. And we recognize this style pretty quickly in our work. We see so on. Maybe you guys are avid readers. Maybe you have a favorite author. I love C.S. Lewis. I've read a lot of C.S. Lewis's work. I was listening to a debate a while ago, and a man in the debate quoted C.S. Lewis, and I'm like, that doesn't sound like C.S. Lewis. And I went scouring all of the works I had of C.S. Lewis and online, and I couldn't find the quote. I found the quote in one website that also said it was from C.S. Lewis, but I couldn't find the source. But it just didn't sit right with me. I'm like, that doesn't sound like Lewis. And so that's what we're looking for in Mark. Does it sound like Mark? Does it have his voice? And so we're going to look a little bit at that internal evidence. So internal evidence, lack of characteristic Markan words. This section is noticeably missing some of Mark's favorite words, such as euthys, which is the word for immediately, a term he uses frequently in earlier chapters, and palin, meaning again. So as you read through the Gospel of Mark, depending on how your translation handles it, you may not see it as clearly as some more formal translations, but Mark has this habit, this style of writing. I say Mark is the gospel of action, all right? He doesn't give you time to breathe. As you're reading, all of a sudden, immediately this happened. Immediately that happened. And again, this happened. And again, that happened. And immediately, and again, and immediately. And again, immediately, and again. And you're like, can I just take a breath? And he doesn't give you any time to breathe. And so the question is should we expect Mark to use this sort of verbiage immediately and again in the long ending? Here's the thing. Some scholars, again, Mark scholars, gospel scholars, they'll say there's not really strong evidence that we should expect to see euthys anywhere in the longer ending. And so its absence doesn't weigh against it. Other scholars will say palin, the word again, the only place they could see a place that might fit is in verse 12. So if you look at verse 12, it says after this. This would be a place where Mark might use the word again. But even those scholars say there's already a time delineator there, and the way this time delineator is used isn't inconsistent with Mark. And so it's really hard to say that we should expect to see euthys or palin in this longer ending. So I say this is interesting evidence, but I don't find it to be very strong. Even I'm talking about scholars who think the longer ending isn't authentic. They're saying, I don't see good reason to suggest that we should see it in there. Okay, moving on. The title Lord Jesus appears in verse 19, but it's not used anywhere else in the Gospel of Mark. That's interesting. To me, Mark just doesn't refer to Jesus this way as Lord Jesus. Okay, Jesus by itself, the Christ, things of that nature, the Messiah, but he just doesn't title him Lord Jesus. That's interesting. Some might make the case, well, this is how the progression of the story goes. This is post-resurrection language, Lord Jesus. Okay. Interesting, but not necessarily a ton of weight. Kyrios. The word Kyrios is used as a divine title for Jesus in verse 20, but Mark typically uses it in a secular sense or as a reference to God in the Old Testament. I would say that this statement is generally true. And when I began to work through the Gospel of Mark and looked at all of the uses of the word Lord, I would say most of the time that Lord comes up, it is actually the equivalent to us saying sir. Okay, it's not necessarily a divine title. However, the very first two times in Mark chapter 1 that Kyrios is used, I do think it's directly identifying Jesus as Lord of all. And so I find this argument to be overstated. Okay? If the very first two times, I don't see why the end couldn't be that way as well. So I think this is an overstatement. The grammatical changes between verses 6 and 9 being passive and active respectively. This is an interesting one. So change in resurrection narrative. The earlier account in Mark 16:6 uses the passive construction, he has risen, whereas in the longer ending, he uses the active voice, he rose. So they're saying there's a style change in verse 6 and 9. When I started working through this, I don't think it's the same context. In verse 6, you have the angel saying it. It's part of a quote. And in verse 9, it's narrative. And so I think that explains the difference between the active and passive voice here. And so I don't put a lot of weight on this stylistic argument either. I think this is easily answered. This one, abrupt connection. The narrative connection between verse 8 and verse 9 is grammatically and literarily awkward, making a jarring transition from the fear of the woman to the tomb to Jesus's appearance. All right, so this one's a little bit different. And this one, you will probably skip right over this in English because it's not jarring in English, but it is in Greek. How this ends in verse 8 is, it says, and they said nothing to anyone since they were afraid. Okay, you see those pronouns there? Those pronouns are referring to the women, okay? In Greek, in English, we want to do this as well, but context tells us, but in Greek, it's more solid. You want a noun referent before or somewhere near your pronouns, okay? Somewhere near. You need that noun reference. And so in verse 9, it says, early on the first day of the week after he had risen. That pronoun he is jarring. It doesn't work in Greek because the he, Jesus, has not been referenced. He's earlier. And so the earliest reference is still those females. And so there would need to be in Greek this reference to Jesus as a noun before we start using the pronoun for him, okay? Now, to me, normally I would kind of glaze over this argument, but Snap actually agrees. So Snap, who's an advocate for a longer ending, and this argument is against longer ending, he agrees. He does think this is jarring in Greek, as a Greek scholar himself. This is awkward. This is not how Greek usually works, okay? And this becomes part of Snap's reasoning for why this is a different work that's added to the Gospel of Mark. This hurts Lund's argument that this is just one cohesive narrative, but Snap has his theory as to what happened. It is a separate work. It's just Markan, okay? So that's that jarring jump that you see in Greek. That one weighs on me more, only because I have both sides agreeing that this is jarring in Greek, okay? And I think Snap is a much better Greek scholar than Lund is, in my opinion, just reading through their works. So for Snap to agree to this, I give it more weight just because both sides are agreeing, okay? Next one, is the reintroduction of characters. In verse 9, reintroduces Mary Magdalene as if she had not been previously mentioned, despite her role immediately preceding the verses in 1547 and in 16:8. All right. Mary Magdalene has been referenced multiple times throughout the Gospel of Mark. She's always referred to as Mary Magdalene. That's it. She's never given this extra descriptors that we're seeing in verse 9, that she is, as it put it, Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. This is what they call identifying remarks, to let you know who this person is. All right. Normally, this sort of thing happens early in a narrative and it doesn't happen again. So early in the narrative, all of the identifying remarks that need to be given are given early on, and then they reference them more simply later, unless it's a very common name. So Mary will be Mary, the mother of Jesus, will always be. Mary Magdalene would always be Mary Magdalene, because Mary's too common of a name just to write Mary. Uncommon names will given less reference because of that. And there's actually been whole studies on the names of the first century. I've talked about it before, super interesting. But for here, for Mary Magdalene to get extra identifiers at the end of the narrative is weird. It's awkward. In fact, Luke is the only other author to do this. Identify Mary Magdalene as the one who has 7 demons cast out of her. And when does Luke do it? The first time Mary Magdalene is mentioned in chapter 7. And he doesn't do it again after that. So this is awkward for Mary Magdalene to be reintroduced with identifying remarks, even though she's been being talked about all along, as if now we need to know who she is. That's interesting. All right. Those, I think, are the more weak but interesting style issues that come up. Now I'm going to get into ones that are even more technical and more interesting, at least to me. Markan use of conjunctions, kai and de, mostly synonymous, meaning and, also, and but, okay? In Mark, he likes to use either kai or de, all right? So what Mark does is he uses the conjunction and a lot, all right? He does it frequently. One of the people I was reading, I forget his name, but when he suggested it'd be like what Mark does here in Greek and English would sound like a 6-year-old telling you about her day. And so then I went to school and we ate lunch and we studied English and we did our numbers and we went out for recess and we, this massive long run-on sentence. That's how Mark writes. And it's very, they would say, infantile in Greek and in English. But it's not in Hebrew. That's normal grammar writing in Hebrew. And so we see Mark is heavily influenced in Hebrew. And we talked about this when we looked at Genesis 1 before, where we just showed how many times the word and just shows up in Hebrew over and over again, creating this massively long sentence, or just a bunch of sentences that start with the word and. Mark writes like a Hebrew writer. He uses and all the time. That would be the word for vav in Hebrew, and he does that. Now, what's interesting is Mark tends to prefer kai over de. It's not that he never uses de. He does use it, but generally speaking, he uses kai significantly more than he uses de. The other gospel writers all use de. In fact, the whole entire Greek writing world prefers to use de over kai in all of their writings. So Mark is unique in the fact that he likes to use kai over de, even though these are synonymous words and somewhat interchangeable. De is the more common usage. He likes to use kai. But in the longer ending, if you separate the longer ending, de is used significantly more frequently than kai is, which demonstrates that this is probably a different writer, a writer who's more familiar with Greek and less familiar with Mark's writings or even Hebrew. And so that I find interesting. Now, Lund tries to address this issue by pointing out a couple of places where this sort of flip happens, but the problem is Lund chooses examples that are not narrative. They're more like in quotations, where Jesus is talking like through a parable or something like that, not through narrative. When Mark is narrating, it's Kai, and that's what happens is. And then we have in verse 19. Verse 19 is actually very interesting. In verse 19, you'll see in your Bibles, depending on your translation, it might say something to the effect of so the, or so then, or after, or when. Okay, that indicator there. This is the sort of place Mark would use the word Kai. This is where we would expect it. And the actual word here in verse 19, men un, which makes up the so the, so then, when, this, whatever your translation does, men un, this is the only place this phrase shows up in the entire Gospel of Mark. Normally, this sort of thing would not show up, and it would be just Kai. Kai would show up. Now, Mark uses both men and un, but never together. A men un like this is not used anywhere in the Gospel of Mark, okay? So that's interesting. This would be, people who understand Mark, this would be characteristic of Mark to say right here he would use a Kai, generally. And here for using a so then, that's unlike him. He doesn't do that anywhere else in the Gospel. So that's interesting. So again, someone like this, something like this, while it's more complicated, Snap would suggest that it's possible when Mark wrote this longer ending that he was just more familiar with typical Greek grammar at this point. So it was just later in his career. Okay, maybe. I guess that's a possibility. Another possibility is that Mark didn't actually write this with his own hand, okay, but he used an amanuensis, or a secretary. And so what we see is the secretary style coming through. So Mark might have dictated Kai, and the secretary would have written men un, being more formal himself, okay? That's a possibility if an amanuensis is involved. We know amanuenses are used throughout the Old and New Testament. This is not an uncommon thing to have a secretary write on behalf of the apostle or the disciple or Mark. So that's a possibility. But it's definitely interesting that Mark doesn't write this way. Mark's use of the historic present. Now, if you have an NASB, in a historic present in Greek, there's this function in which Greek will sometimes speak of past events in the present tense. All right? So imagine it says, yesterday, Jesus is going into Jericho. You're like, no, yesterday Jesus went to Jericho. Right. Proper English, you have to use past tense. Yesterday Jesus went. In Greek, you don't have to do that. In Greek, you can do exactly what I just said. Yesterday Jesus goes into Jericho. That's called the historic present. Now, in none of our English translations will translate in proper English that way. And so you won't see it show up in any of your translations except the NASB family. As far as I'm aware, the NASB family is the only translation to actually tell you when they're going to switch the historic present to past tense, okay? And so if you look at Mark chapter 16, verses 2 through 4, I put it on the screen here because not everybody in here has an NASB, but it says, and very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. They were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us? And looking up, they noticed that the stone had been rolled away, for it was extremely large. You'll notice that both came and noticed has an asterisk after it. All right, that's in the NSB. This is a feature of the NSB translation. They will then have their footnote that says asterisks, and asterisks in the text marks the verbs that are historical presents in the Greek, which have been translated with an English past tense in order to conform to modern usage. So it would read, and very early on the first day of the week, they are coming to the tomb in Greek. Or, and looking up, they notice that the stone had been rolled away. Okay, so in Greek, it doesn't transfer well in English. All right, because this is the end, I'm going to leave you kind of on a cliffhanger here, how Mark uses the historic present throughout his gospel and how it's used in the long ending. Okay, so we'll pick up here next week with the historic present, and we'll continue through the style of Mark. I have finished all my slides for Mark, so hopefully this is the end. Next week will be the end of this conversation about the long ending of Mark and what do we do with it. But we're going to continue through different styles and different features of Mark's style, picking up next week with the historic present. You all are dismissed. Thank you.